All right, perfect.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so welcome everyone. It's good to see so many faces here. Yeah, before I'm going to announce what we're going to do today, during the event, if you have any questions during the presentation, please collect them. And you can either post them in the chat or you can just, collect them for yourself. And then after Julia is done with her presentation, you can raise your hand and actually speak up. And my colleague Masha is going to otherwise take care of it and moderate the Q&A session, go through the chat and go through your questions. But first of all, now I want to warmly welcome everyone who is here, but especially also Julia Fa, who is a Senior Research Associate at the Center for International Forestry Research at CIFOR. And she brings more than 30 years of experience in academic research and also teaching in conservation science. And currently, she is a professor for biodiversity and human development at the Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. But also visiting professor at the University of Malaga in Spain and a research fellow at the University of Gibraltar. And her research itself is pretty interdisciplinary, I would say, since it spans from biology to economics to anthropology and focusing on human livelihoods and zoonotic diseases. She has also worked for the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust in Jersey. And she is also part of the one of the field projects of the Alliance on Mitigating Risk of Disease Transmission in the Wild Meat Food Chain from Forest to Fork in Cameroon. But today she is going to talk about working with rural and indigenous communities to understand wildlife use and zoonotic diseases. For those of you who have joined our last expert talk that has focused on emerging infectious diseases, at the animal-human interface and the animal origin of...
Oh, sorry. Do that, yeah. We can...
Yes, okay, sorry, thank you. And yeah, our last expert talk has focused more on the animal origin of zoonotic viruses. Now we're gonna proceed more to focus on the behavioral changes and the behavioral aspects. Yeah, and so Julia is going to present on the importance of the collaboration between researchers and especially the local communities. She will share her experiences from the Amazon and the Congo Basin and her insights on especially the cultural aspects that impact zoonotic disease risk. And yeah, we're very excited to hear about the connection between the traditional ecological knowledge, modern science, and how this can safeguard human and wildlife well-being, and especially also the responsibilities and the synergies between conserving ecosystems and mitigation of zoonotic threats, and just the crucial role of community-driven partnerships. Thank you very much, Julia, for being here today, and we're very excited for your talk.
Thank you very much, Anne. I think it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm sorry we can't do these in person because I always like through meeting three-dimensional people, not two-dimensional ones, but very happy to be here. What I want to do today, within an hour or so, I want to be able to finish with enough time to have questions from you. I want to give you a very broad overview on what it is to work with communities, especially in tropical areas, to try to come up with ways of resolving issues around wild meat. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what citizen science is all about, because ultimately that's what we are saying, and then go into examples of the Amazon basin, and then tell you a little bit about the work that we're doing thanks to the Alliance and thanks to GIZ, the work that we're doing in Cameroon, so an update on that. If I start my presentation, working with rural and indigenous communities, meaning that ultimately, we want to understand, we want to co-create, we want to make sure that we come up with solutions alongside people that are in the field, that actually live in those habitats that we are interested in. The talk around, in fact, most of the work that we do revolves around wild meat. And I think the first thing that we have to say is that wild meat is incredibly important for many, many millions of people throughout the global south. And if we look at the data that Martin Nielsen came up with quite recently, and very, very good paper, where based on 1 year quarterly income surveys of a very large number of households, about 8,000 households in 24 countries in the global south, Latin America, Asia, and Africa, what we see is that 39% of the sampled households actually harvest white meat. But it's very important as well is on average, wild meat made up about 2% of the household's income, of which own consumption was about 89%. We're talking very large number of people dependent on wild meat. And this reliance is highest amongst the poorest household and inversely related to the reliance on domestic animal income. Seasonally, there is reliance on wild meat, but this is inversely related to other incomes, suggesting a gap-filling function. And the fact that hunting is of low economic importance, but widespread and mostly for subsistence, suggests that wild meat is important in all of the rural household diets that have been studied. So hunting appears economically sustainable in 78% of the observer communities, although in most cases this might represent what we call a post-depletion sustainability. And I'd like you to focus on the fact that because there are so many millions of people that are dependent on wild meat, it is incumbent to us to try to come up, for example, with some ideas of what the extraction is. If we look at the two main tropical forest basins, what we do see is that we're dealing with very large volumes of wild meat that's actually extracted. We've estimated close to about 5 million metric tons of wild meat that are extracted every year in the Amazon basin and in the Congo basin. This is not a small sum. This is incredibly important. And when we add it to the fact that there is that dependence on wild meat for food security, we have got to do whatever needs to be done in order to stop this from happening, the decline to happen. And targeting rural supply and reducing urban demand is one of the most important issues in the work that we're all doing in terms of wild meat sustainable use and so on. So any sustainable management of wild meat requires addressing both the rural supply as well as the urban demand. Rural supply in the sense that we've got to ensure that there is a sustainable extraction of wild meat in these areas, because the people that live in the forest areas or in the habitats where wild meat exists are totally dependent on that, as we have seen from Nielsen's work. So interventions should cover the entire value chain, involving local hunting communities, middlemen, traders, of course, consumers, and society at large. So when we want to achieve sustainable wild meat use, there are three important things that we must do. One of them has to do with ensuring informed decision-making. In other words, we need robust data and indicators of overexploitation and impacts of ecosystems, health, livelihoods, and so on. That crucial data must be there before we can make insightful approaches, holistic approaches of the interconnectedness between overexploitation and all these other aspects that affect human health, well-being, and so on. But one of the things that is vitally important and we tend to forget, because often these things are not well supported by funding agencies, is the incorporation of biological insights, because we need to understand relevant biological metrics of game species in order to understand and make sure that we come up with sustainable practices. So the way to do it, I feel, is by incorporating the communities, of course. And this is because when we look at professional monitoring, this is going to be very difficult to implement throughout the world because it's costly relatively to the conservation agency budgets. If you look how much it will be to bring in professionals and professional scientists into all of the areas of the world that we want to look at. And it is incredibly important to try and bring in other stakeholders, because any failure to bring in the communities, we are going to fail in actually collecting the information and making sure that that information is used to make a difference in sustainable wildlife use in this particular case. So in order to move away from the costliness of professional monitoring, we can use all the different aspects of citizen science projects that range from contractual obligations with communities to contributory, in which the projects are actually designed with the members of the public to contribute data. This is much more common in the North than in the global South, but it can be collaborative, as in the case of the work that we're doing in the Amazon and other parts. This is where there is a contribution of data, these para-ecologists, as we call them, contribution of data from communities, so that together we can co-create solutions to problems that actually affect them. And this sharing of knowledge, which involves the sharing of traditional ecological knowledge and academic ecological knowledge, is the basis of what we should be doing now and into the future, because frankly, we haven't got time to start thinking only in terms of professionals going into the field and collecting information that is useful for us. So community-based monitoring, which is what we're going to be dealing with here, embraces a broad range of approaches, from self-monitoring of things like harvest, to censuses by local rangers, to inventories by amateur naturalists. Many of these are directed to resource management, but monitoring, of course, may vary from individual animals and plants through habitats to ecosystem goods and services. In fact, all monitoring is carried out at a local scale by individuals with little formal education, and local people or local government staff are directly involved in data collection and, in most instances, analyses. This community-based monitoring is cheaper at the end of the day, like we've said, that a professional monitoring. And here is an example from Zhao, from the Chinese and in Yunnan area, where it shows you very clearly that you can do it far, far cheaper if you involve community monitors rather than actual trained botanists. And more so, about 89% of the expenses are actually kept within the village and not actually flow out into many areas. But not everything is perfect within community-based monitoring projects. This is a study that has just come out by a number of Brazilian colleagues that are doing this work. And even though there are quite a number of community-based monitoring projects throughout the world based on game terrestrial fauna, most of them are interrupted due to lack of funding. And the other problem is that the absence of any spatial-temporal data analyses actually prevents the provision of information on monitoring resource, on the monitoring resource. The most important thing is that the empowerment and management actions have been hampered by the lack of local participation. So even though we believe that community-based monitoring is the way forward, we have to be careful, to make these approaches actually work, because they do need the full participation of the communities and resources to be able to continue it over a longer period of time than just 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. The important thing is that in the case of wild meat, community monitoring can actually help in terms of coming up with sustainable hunting practices, knowing more about the biology of game species, understanding the incidence of diseases in wild meat, and obviously trying to come up ways of improving food security and nutrition of those communities that are dependent on wild meat, amongst other natural resources. What I'm going to show you now, hopefully very quickly, is a series of projects that have been carried out in the Amazon by colleagues of mine and myself that gives you a very broad picture of how communities-based monitoring can actually help in all these different aspects of understanding game species, understanding sustainability, and making sure that at the end of the day, this information is actually carried out to protect wildlife and to ensure that people are well fed and carry on their living. If you look at wild meat hunting in Amazonia, this is some work that we are currently preparing, that we have almost ready. In fact, you can see in the map that it is widespread, but it's not widespread in the same sort of way throughout the Amazon basin. There are 34 million inhabitants. About 25% of these are actually dependent on the hunting. Many indigenous groups, as well as local communities, colonists that have actually taken over most of the Amazon basin. Every single spot that you see there in green are actually communities that have actually contributed information on extraction rates of different species of wild meat. So what I'm showing you is a very splendid map, which we have generated through actually the participation of communities by actually them sharing data of how much has been collected, gathered throughout a period of a year or longer. And that allows us to try to understand how much is extracted and where it is extracted. So my first point is that by actually having these large-scale community projects, we can have a very good idea of what is happening in a scale such as the Amazon basin. We should do it in the Congo basin much more, and certainly in many other areas of the world where tropical forests are found. The work that I'm going to show you is work that has been generated and done in the field by people like Thais Morcati, who's a very, very able Brazilian biologist, now working at UCL in London, by Dr. Hani Elbrizi, who is now working in Salford University. He was my PhD student, and I'm very, very pleased that he's now with us here in the UK, sort of working on these very vital issues. And last but not least is Dr. Pedro Mayor from the University of Barcelona. He's been instrumental in changing the way that we look at how communities can provide information, not only in terms of wildlife and hunting, but also on the disease front. I'm not going to talk too much about disease in this particular part of the talk, but I will give you an idea of how incredibly useful working with communities can be in generating information about a number of different things to do with wild meat use in these areas. There are a number of communities that we have worked with, the Yavari Mirin in Peru, and the Amanya and Mamirua in Brazil. These are rural communities that are made up of indigenous as well as local European ancestry groups, caboclos, many others, but they actually cover a very large area within that particular part of the Amazon basin. And this is an area which gets flooded every year, and the flooding pulses are incredibly important for us to understand because they change the landscape, they change the way people use the landscape within this particular part of the world. The first thing I want to actually make an emphasis on is the fact that this has been going on for a long time. There's about 19 years of data that I will show you that we have been able to use to look at the different results to do with wild animal use. We have about 11 communities that have been monitored successfully over time, about 13,000, close to 14,000 individual animals hunted, and more than 3,000 samples collected. This, I'm stopping at 2018, but of course, we continue collecting data, working with communities to come up with the solutions. And there are a number of basic methods that we use. Communities help us look at issues to do with reproduction. And here we have a very unsightly scene, I'm afraid, but actually shows you how the communities themselves, people within the community, hunters, are able to process animals, extract information, and then use the meat for their own use. We don't give anyone any incentive to hunt. All of these communities are actually participating in this project because we know that information is going to be vital to understand issues to do with sustainability of hunting, use of the environment in general. There is storage of material, and most of the materials is actually stored in formaldehyde, reduced, of course, to about 14%. And the communities and the hunters themselves are actually collecting that material, storing them so that it can be used later on and analyzed to look at patterns of reproduction, as I said, and many other different issues. So basic biological information, like, simple things like, do we know enough about the genitalia of different animals that are hunted in the Amazon? But here are two splendid pictures, I think, of the different organs, the reproductive organs of many different species that allow us to try to understand the level of reproduction and so on. And of great importance as well is all the information that we can get in terms of prenatal development. Here is some work that we did on lowland paca, and it will give you an idea whether we're dealing with precocial or artificial animals. And this is vital information to try to understand the game species that we're dealing with. Certainly, one of the things that we did find out was that there is an underestimate of what lowland pacas can actually do in terms of reproduction in the area. These are slower breeders than we think they were, because we tend to have the impression that all rodents are highly fecund, that reproduce at a far higher rate than any other species. That is not true for all of them. And if we know something about the breeding rate and how quickly they become mature and all that, we can then start understanding more about how much and how many animals we can take out of a system itself, because the reproductive rate of these species is fundamental, like in any other system that applies hunting data and quota to any species that's been used. So one of the things that we can do, and certainly can be done throughout the world, is use reproductive information, data that's actually collected by the communities themselves, to look at the whether they actually fit the data that has been used in sustainability models. I'm not actually saying that sustainability models on their own are the only way forward, because there are issues to do with the models that have been used up till now. But for example, if we take into account the most important model that has been used in looking at hunting sustainability, the Robinson Redford model, we can actually use the data collected in the field by communities to really try to understand whether the measurements that we have for the intrinsic rate of natural increase, which is vital in the formulation of these models, whether the data that is currently used is actually true if in comparison to the data that's actually collected in the field. And the reason why this is the case, that often most of the application of the Robinson and Redford model tend to use data that comes from captive animals. And this can be complicated, because it doesn't necessarily mean that a captive animal is going to have the same element, so the same parameters, the same issues to do with reproductive rates, etc., that can allow us to understand or to apply the Robinson and Redford model, if we want to do that, in the best possible way. So the data collected by communities that we have analyzed actually shows you that there are severe differences between the information that normally people use in these hunting models and the data that comes from the field. And here we have three examples that I've highlighted. Red-brocketed deer, white-lipped peccary, collared peccary, basically the ungulates are overestimated in the normal data, in the usual data we tend to apply in the Robinson and Redford models. So there is up to about 46% difference between the previous captive data and the new data that has been collected in the field, with those communities helping us. And we can see the difference also in agoutis, which is another it's a species that's very hunted within the South American tropics, and there is basically there is an underestimation. I may have said it the other way around in the other, but basically it's 59% higher than what has been normally used using captive data. So this already comes from the information that's being collected from the communities. And certainly one of the things that we have been able to come up with is how many animals, what is the minimal sample size that we can actually collect in order to have a very good understanding of reproductive rates, etc. So here we show you that if we go for 5% confidence limit, which is very high, we would have to collect a very large number of animals. But if we go to a 10%, knowing what the expected pregnancy rates from empirical data collected in the field, we can actually come up with manageable numbers from the 74 to 94, which is quite reasonable for us to collect. In other words, because we have that data for 18 years, we have been able to say, not come up with information that tells us more about the sustainability of hunting, but also tell us how many animals do we need to come up with these sort of results. Remember that none of these communities are actually being incentivized to carry on hunting. They hunt because they need that food. They hunt because they have been hunting all their lives and for a long, long time. The other piece of data that I want to show you is how we can combine good biological data, good environmental data, and good hunting data to look at how the intricacies of environment and people and wildlife interact. And this is a study we did primarily looking at lowland paca. Lowland paca is a species that's most hunted in all of South America. But we started looking at environmental drivers as well as hunting, as well as reproductive seasonality of the lowland paca from the community information that we were able to produce. So let me very quickly tell you one of the things that we had to do from the start was to come up with a very good idea when conception and pregnancies do take place. Without that information, it's very difficult to actually come up with any idea of reproductive seasonality. So the first thing was data collected from the animals hunted, and we can have a look at the crown rump length in relation to age, and that gives us an idea when things are beginning to start in terms of conception, and we also know where parturition is going to happen. Using that basic data, we can then move on to looking at what is the relationship between rainfall and tree-bearing fruits in the area. And tree-bearing fruits are very important because they produce the food that the packers are using. So one thing is very clear, that the percentage of trees bearing fruit and rainfall is correlated, a very wiggly sort of correlation, but there is a correlation between the amount of rain and the percentage number of bearing fruit. We can take it further and look at temporal trends of river water level, because a river water level has to do with movement of hunters, and of course hunting rates are related to the water level in these particular areas. So hunting rates goes up when the water level goes up, and we know that seasonality of fruiting trees is related to the availability of water. In other words, rainfall influences the amount of fruit, and rainfall also influences the water level of the rivers, and the water level of rivers actually affects the number of hunters that go out hunting for these. There's also a relationship between pregnancy rate of the paca and the hunting rates in both areas that we were working in. This actually means that, of course, hunting rate, parturition, basically pregnancy and water, as you can see in the bottom graph, is very correlated. So it means when water levels are high, more people go out hunting, but that's when most of the pregnant females are found. And you can see that there is a very strong correlation in both study areas between the percentage of pregnant females and the number of pregnant females, the percentage of hunted females as well. I'm not going to go into these details, but you can see that these correlations are very clear between pregnancy rate and percentage of tree-bearing fruits, the percentage of conceptions and rainfall. All of this data is being obtained from the community activities that we have undertaken in these areas. So we can end up by looking at these three-pronged correlations between fruiting, between rainfall, between fruiting and pregnancy, and about the fact that in a way, secondarily, rainfall also affects the number of people that go out, the number of hunters go out hunting. So one of the things that comes out of this study is that we have to be aware that these seasonality patterns could have a negative impact on the long-term survival, if you want, if you take it to that extreme, of pakas, because there have been more pregnant females have been hunted. So this information actually gives us the possibility of actually working with the communities so that we move away, if possible, from actually doing most of the hunting during the high water level, which is when most of the pakas are actually pregnant. The other thing that I want to show you is that we can actually further train communities to actually themselves tell us about the status of the species in terms of reproduction in this case. And this is work that was done in a number of communities in which we looked at ways of detecting the pregnancy level, at which time, what conceptus level that was, the size that was. And instead of actually using professional biologists to do that all the time, we were training community members to be able to do that. This is a picture of non-pregnant genitalia as well as pregnant genitalia. We can actually detect it because we know the size of the embryos in there, but you can actually use that data to look at issues of CPUE, the annual pregnancy rates, all this determined from the information that actually comes from the communities themselves. What we do show in our study is that the probability of local people correctly diagnosing pregnancy in the pictures that we show them of lowland pakas actually varies between sex and age of the interviewees, but there is an improvement of the number of people that were able to identify correctly the conceptors. So there's very clear correlation between pregnancy rates in the hunting register, in other words, the information that we have from the biologists, and the monthly pregnancy rates from the genitalia itself, which is obviously important. But we know that there is an improvement rate in percentage, the probability of local people correctly diagnosing pregnancy from pictures of genitalia of lowland pakas. This actually means that we can very clearly encourage people to do this sort of work without having biologists coming into the area. We will have this groups of individuals not only taking out the organs and actually storing them for later analysis of biologists, but actually showing and making sure that they themselves are able to collect the data and give us the information already analyzed up to a point. The last section of the talk is, well, we've seen all these different ideas, different ways of working with communities in the Amazon basin. Can we actually transfer that to other areas of the world? And certainly what we have done, we've done that not only for this, more reproductive oriented type of work, well, we've done it with Brazilian colleagues to look at ways in which how we can transfer techniques and methods used in the Amazon, how we can transfer them to tropical rainforests in the Congo basin, and how we can learn on a south-south platform rather than rely on that commonly used vertical north-south arrangement. And this is part of the Alliance GIZ funded project that we're doing in Cameroon. And one of the things that we're doing is very much, again, generating or training or working with communities so they become themselves the providers of information on not just the reproduction of the different game species that I'm looking at, but also on pathogens that may be, or at least prepare the information so that we can look at pathogens that may be affecting the animals, and of course, in relation, consequently, the people that are using wild meat. So what we're doing as well is qualitatively try to understand through participant observation methods, handling practices, and how these have implications on the risk of foodborne diseases. And ultimately co-design, along with participant communities, a social and behavioral theory of change to try to halt these foodborne diseases in particular, and so on. And the reason why we are focusing on foodborne diseases is that although we know that viruses are important, the actual basically the pathogens that affect most of the people are actually foodborne rather than the viruses themselves. And this is something that we can discuss around here. Our team in Cameroon is made up of members of our team in the Amazon, Pedro Mayor here. The team is actually composed and led in the field by Guillermo Ross, who has been working with me a long time in Cameroon. But we brought in Dr. Sara Soto, who is an epidemiologist and bacteriologist, and who comes with many years of experience. And here we see the team actually showing our village reporters. We are working in 4 different villages, how to go about dissecting an animal and collecting the sort of data that we have been collecting in the Amazon up to now. We have very clear protocols that they will use. This is a schema of how we teach our village reporters to collect information, which will then be used to show hunters how to collect the data. But we're much more interested in issues to do with cross-contamination. For example, these are butchering areas in the villages where we're working in. A very, very clear scenario for cross-contamination between domestic animals and wild animals. The direct contact of bodily fluids and biting and injuries while handling carcasses, very important as a means of transmission of disease. And of course, unhygienic behaviors that increases the contamination of surfaces of clothes and utensils that then get brought over to the mouth or to the food that people are using. These are some results. There are many other results that have been analyzed at the moment, but to give you an idea of what we're dealing with, and that is that there are many, many different strains of bacteria that are found not just in wild meat, but also in the utensils that people are using, etc. So we have to be careful with this. We have to make sure that we're not just focusing on the viral aspects and not on the things that are obviously affecting people on a daily basis. If you look at the number of strains that are pathogenic, 172, this is something that is of great concern. For us, the next steps are very much to plan for solution, try to block the spread of the disease. Things like, techniques, behavior change, and how you deal with surfaces, how you need to wash your hands, etc. selecting barriers and coming up with social roles within the community that can identify who will be able to undertake tasks that actually protects the entire community from any form of disease, particularly in this case, foodborne diseases. The next stage is to plan for change. We are doing work in terms of behavior change already with the general project financed by the Alliance. But what needs to be done is go beyond just the use of information and come up with ways in which we can change behavior over a long period of time and actually measure those changes, indicators of change. So I'd like to end by actually coming up with 6 steps of a community-based monitoring that is vital for us to always understand. And of course, the first thing is to work with the responsible institutions and the interested stakeholders on what needs to be done and how the work that you're going to do with them is going to be of importance to them. We need to use existing knowledge. I talked about that important combination, that Venn diagram of traditional ecological knowledge and academic knowledge that must come together, and we must make the most out of the different areas or disciplines of knowledge. We need to understand and come up with an institutional framework for using the results of monitoring for adaptive management. Very often, we have data accumulating from areas where we have been working, and we don't have any idea what we're going to do with that information in order to make things better later on. And more importantly, we tend to forget to take back that information to the communities. We tend to keep it ourselves or use it for our papers, and we don't really think that they need to know what I've done and why it is important. Developing sampling strategies are vital. If we don't do it, then we're not going to be able to get the right sort of data. But we also need to understand what, how, where and when is that data going to be collected. Once you've done these 4 steps, we can begin implementation on the ground. And ultimately, like I've said, we need to discuss the results with local and national stakeholders and again, revise the strategy for the monitoring accordingly. This is not something that only happens in 3 years. This is something that needs continuity, that needs funding, that needs the interest of the stakeholders at national and international levels. So my conclusions are very simple. Participatory correction of biological materials and other sorts of information is indeed an efficient way of studying wild species because they relate to the use of wild meat in many parts of the world. Let's not shy away from basic studies. We tend to be thinking always in terms of the more esoteric questions, but we need basic studies to be able to support conservation actions. We tend to think that having information on reproductive biology of animals is something that only natural historians do. And therefore, it is often very difficult to get funding for that sort of work. I believe that basic natural history alongside perhaps a more hypothetical deductive reasoning sort of approach is fundamental. And of course, it is, in my opinion, we need to replicate what we've done in the Amazon in other parts of the world so that we can accumulate more information. Imagine if we had sentinel areas in the Amazon, in the Congo Basin, in many other parts of the world that are generating information that we can use to look at the state of wildlife conservation as well as ways in which we can improve the livelihoods of people in these areas that are dependent on wildlife. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for this very insightful talk and also giving us such a good holistic perspective on your research and all the different aspects that you focus on and how to engage with the communities, including them, capacity building. Very interesting. Thank you so much. Now it's time for everyone to post their questions if you have them. We've already seen one in the chat, but also please feel free to raise your hand and come forward and just talk and engage in the discussion. But yeah, we can just maybe...
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the first question. This is the one from Mark Jones. Martin, if you want to speak up, you can unmute yourself and directly ask a question. Otherwise, I will just read it out loud. Oh yeah, here you go.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. Mark Jones from the Born Free Foundation based in the UK. Really interesting talk. Thank you very much. One of my questions was around how you differentiate between subsistence and commercial use. And as I'm sure you're all aware, the boundaries between subsistence and commercial use have become more blurred over the years, and whether the methodologies you've described can be useful in trying to establish, the degree to which species are being affected by subsistence use and the degree to which that use has been commercialized to supply international markets or urban communities or whatever.
Thank you, Mark. And I think that's a very important point. The communities I have shown you are primarily subsistence hunters. I'm talking about in the Amazon basin. We have information on how much of that meat that they hunt is actually sold on to urban areas. And you probably know that even though we've always talked about the Congo Basin being the most important area in terms of urban meat, this is happening also in the Amazon Basin. We have published information how much of that meat is actually going to the cities, the big towns within the Amazonas area in Brazil. So in answer to your question, there is information of how much of that meat is sold on. So we can actually tell you from each of the communities what proportion of the meat is actually sold. But I think it's very important to make a distinction between the short value chains and the long value chains. I still think, and this is something that needs to be elaborated much more, that it probably doesn't matter if you're selling to your neighbor or you're selling to a nearby village, especially because there are older people that can't go hunting, etc. But it is a problem when hunters are dedicating most of the time to sending meat through middlemen to the big towns, not just in the Congo Basin, but also in the Amazon Basin. So thank you for your question, Mark. I hope I've answered it.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, yeah, I think that's it. I think the answer was good enough. Yeah, thumbs up. Thank you very much, Mark. We have another question coming from Skylar Hopkins. Also for you, if you want to speak up, you can unmute yourself and then the stage is yours.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much.
Okay.
My question is really about thinking about like the logistics of this kind of research. And so maybe part of it is, could you speak to sort of like the biosecurity or like PPE requirements for people that are helping with data collection? And the other part is like, how did you navigate like institutional approval to involve people in this kind of research?
Okay, I think I'll start with the last question. Approval, in the case of Brazil and Peru, I won't call it easy, but certainly we have been working in these areas for a long, long time. And the Peruvian government, as well as Brazil government, are very supportive of the work that we've done. And therefore, sort of permits are ongoing and, you know, will continue, hopefully, because of that. I don't know what the sentiment of your question is, but we can explore that a little bit more. In Africa, the same thing. So in Cameroon, we have to come up with protocols that revolve around the ethics of the work that we do and how we're going to, you know, we don't go into any area without actually starting with an ethic and a free, prior, informed consent. So everybody in the communities have the right to say, no, I don't want to participate in this, or I want to change the way that we do this, or whatever. Obviously, ethic is incredibly important. The support of the governments is fundamental, and I think we have had that. Now, in terms of PPEs and all that, this is a very poignant question indeed, because we have, in fact, with the Alliance, with our friends in the Alliance, we've talked a lot about how do you actually reduce the probability of disease affecting the people that are working with you. And it's, you know, finally, it is the practices that people are using to support our work are practices that they have been using for quite a long time, hundreds of years, we can say that. So if you are thinking that in order to reduce any spillover or transmission from an animal to a human being, you're going to ask hunters to wear PPEs and, you know, suits, etc. It's not going to be possible at all, because the hunters are not going to do that. Every hunter needs to have a pair of rubber gloves. That's impossible, you know. So we have worked around, not worked around these issues, but we have tried to, as much as possible, minimize the potential risk while they're working with us. For example, if they are handling animals that we're going to use in our work, they will have to wash our hands, they will have to use an apron, etc., etc. And of course, when they're handling biological materials in formaldehyde, that is crucial that they wear a mask, that they wear sort of protection, because nobody handles formaldehyde in the way that we used to. When I was at school, we were given animals to dissect in pure formaldehyde almost. That's not going to happen anymore. Does that help you, Skylar?
Yeah, thank you. That was great. And sorry, that question wasn't meant to be critical. I was just thinking about how hard it is sometimes even to just get approval for like students to work with wild animals. And so I was just wondering, yeah, logistically, if other people wanted to have partnerships like this, how some of that would work. So yeah, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much for the question. We have Daniel raising his hand.
Yeah, hello, hi, I'm Daniel from Germany. Thank you so much for the interesting talk. I found it amazing, all the photos and all the getting a scope of all the steps and practical work. I wanted to ask, are there different or significant differences between the hygienic situation of the hunting and processing, or especially the processing step of these animals in the Amazon and in the Congo basin? That was my first question, because I imagine that despite the poverty in the Amazon area, it is, I would imagine it is certainly a much higher developed area than the DRC. And the other point is, I find it extremely interesting also the concept of applying this methodology to other parts of the world, because also thinking about Southeast Asia with an extremely high level of unsustainable wildlife harvest or hunting, just thinking about snare poaching of pangolins in the Indo-Chinese jungles and so many highly endangered species. These methodology it can be also used as a tool, right, to monitor endangered populations of all kind of mammals, reptiles, and yes, thinking about turtles, pangolins, and so on. So I imagine this should be, I mean, like a broader approach, like, and also coupled with the question, are you interested in, I mean, I would be very much interested also in the future to work in such kind of field, such kind of field work and also data analysis. So if you are like also planning to extend this, if you have partnerships or planning to extend this to other areas in South America or in the Amazon basin alone. I mean, the Amazon basin is as large as Europe, if I'm correct, or big, huge like Europe. So there must be a huge demand of people going into and helping you in this field. And the other question was with the hygienic situation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope I can remember all of your questions, but I like the idea of actually extending it into Asia. I think we still need to do a lot of work in Africa, in the Congo Basin, and in particular. Yes, please, if we can collaborate, if we can work together with you and other people, more than willing to do that. The question about the hygienic conditions, you know, of course, there are issues with the way that people handle food, both in the Amazon as well as the Congo Basin. My impression from having worked in these areas for a long time is that the Amazon has one advantage, and that's a lot more water around than in the areas that we have been working in the Congo Basin and Cameroon. So it means that, you know, in the Amazon, it's typical that if you are handling an animal, you go to the river, and you've seen some of the pictures there, that you handle, you are processing, dressing the carcass while you are in water. So in many ways, you are in better, more hygienic conditions than what you can see in our Cameroon project. So it would be interesting to look at. I know Pedro Mayor, who has been working in the Amazon for many years, has also been changing people's behavior around hygienic processes in the communities. But, you know, sometimes it all depends on the actual community. Some communities are frankly cleaner than others, and we see that in towns in Germany, towns in England, and some towns are better than others. But I am totally convinced, and I think some of you have pointed out, that foodborne diseases are something we need to know much more about than we do. We are too obsessed, in my opinion, about, you know, the bigger pandemic issues, which is important, of course, but I think we need to do the foodborne. Does that answer all of your questions, Daniel, or have I left any out?
I think that's basically it. And if there's some more points, we can exchange email maybe, or just I'll write you. Yeah.
Yes, please. Yes, please. I'm very old and I forget things.
But you can.
Thank you so much for the interesting talk. Yeah.
A pleasure. Let's talk about Asia.
Thank you very much. If you want to reach out, Daniel, you can also write us an email, and we will forward it to Julia, so we do some matchmaking here. That would be great. We have another question. Yeah, we have another question in the chat from Francois. I will read it out loud. The question is, what do you think would be the main challenges to replicate this approach in Central Africa? So this approach of working with communities,
Yes, I think this comes back to the question that Skylar was asking. I mean, the challenges are always, how do you get, first of all, permission from the government to do that sort of work in the communities? That's vital. Secondly, the other challenge is to engage the communities, that this is not just, you know, the important thing, I think, is that we're not just doing research for the sake of research. we are working with them so we can come up with solutions that help them. And I don't want to say it in a way that sounds condescending, but I think it's vitally important that we engage the communities first so that they understand that together we can make improvements in the way things have been going. So those two issues are very important. Collecting the data is very easy because these communities are hunting communities and they will go out every day to hunt. So if we have a clear-cut framework, we can actually get these hunters to participate, to collect the biological materials, to store them, to understand how to analyze them, like I've said, and also come up with a big picture of what's happening throughout a large area like the Congo Basin. So I don't think it's difficult. I think it's a question of persistence, dedication, patience.
Yeah, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? I don't see anything in the chat, but I think now you have the last chance. So either just quickly text it and write it down, or you raise your hand. Oh, here we go. So here we have Erica. You can just unmute yourself and directly ask a question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Julia. I am Erica Alandia from Bolivia, working in the Bolivian Amazon for many years now. And we did some research on doing, checking also for diseases with hunters, basically using feces, for instance, which is easy to preserve using formalin, or some organs also to check some cysts. But the big challenge in these remote communities is the cold chain, for instance, to check for bacteria or viruses. And so when we had people in the field, part of the team working there with the liquid nitrogen, it is possible. But I don't know if you had some other experiences on how to make it more sustainable, because it's not sustainable to have people in the field all the time.
And I think you, again, a very good question, and you've hit the nail on the head. Certainly that's one of the challenges that we have working in Africa, and certainly in the Peruvian or Brazilian Amazon, that if you want to take samples other than bacteria and stuff like that, you need a cold chain, and that's often quite difficult. Obtaining liquid nitrogen can be complicated, and certainly carrying them to these areas. I don't have a good solution for you, Erica, except that and we need to plan better the way that we collect these samples. For example, the bacteria was collected using swabs. So that's quite easy. You put them in the containers, and the containers were taken in this case, they were taken to Barcelona, but we are looking at ways in which we can use local laboratories to do that sort of work. So you can start ticking certain boxes for certain groups of pathogens that we're interested in. Bacteria, relatively easy. If you want to look at viruses, of course, that's more complicated because you need a cold chain. You might be able to get, for example, one of the things that we do is take blood clots on filter paper. That can give you up to a point. But then if you're going to do metagenomics or DNA or whatever, it's much more complicated because you need other materials. I don't know what the solution is. I can tell you everything that is in alcohol or is in formaldehyde, you've got a good chance of getting results from. But other than that, we need to find a way, a non-frozen way to be able to do that work.
Yeah, thank you very much, Erica, also for this question. And yeah, Julia, for your reply and answer. Anyone else who still wants to ask something? Okay, so I just want to like say some final words. Again, if you have further questions that will rise up by the end of the day or tomorrow, feel free to reach out. Julia, if you want to share your email, you can do so as well in the chat. Otherwise, we will forward the questions. We would really appreciate your feedback. So I've posted 2 statements for you to respond to. You will find that in the chat as well. And you can respond by giving a thumbs up or giving a comment to that. That would be really great. I have one last announcement. We have our next webinar in December. So yeah, please get out your calendars and mark the 12th of December. So stay tuned and you will get more information via the newsletter and our website. And I'm really looking forward to meet you all there again. So I think that's for it for today. Yeah, thanks, Julia, for your email address. You will find it now in the chat, everyone. Again, we have recorded this event, so we will find it later on in the members area on the website. You will only have access actually if you're a registered member, but yeah, I think that's not a problem for you. And again, Julia, thank you very much for this really interesting presentation and yeah, a really fruitful discussion as well. I wish you all a great day and then see you next time.
See you next time. Thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed that.
Yeah, I wish you a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.